Please help me in welcoming Professor Bruce Cumings.
Thank you so much, David. That was really a wonderful introduction. I sometimes wonder who that person is when I hear this talk. It's a pleasure to be back at the University of Michigan. My wife, Meredith Wu, taught here for 6 years. And I was here for 6 years, commuting back and forth to Chicago, but tried to keep a really small footprint on the campus here so that I wouldn't develop even more responsibilities than I already had. But it's very nice to be back in Ann Arbor. I have a presentation that will probably, I hope, finish around 5 o'clock. And the weather is appropriate for my presentation today. I'm not bringing a lot of glad tidings. I want to talk at the beginning and through most of the talk about the American bombing campaigns against North Korea during the war, which, I mean, I always think that if I know something, everybody else must know it. I had a domineering big brother who always told me what a dope I was, and so I was about 25 before I had an idea that I thought he didn't already know. And yet when a short book that I published on the 60th anniversary of the war, June 2010, from Random House, when it came out, I was getting emails from people who were amazed or even shocked by some of the things in the book, and the New York Times reviewed it and also found it shocking and all of that, and I thought, why don't people know these things? The Korean War was one of the most destructive in 20th century history, both in the South and the North, but it was more destructive in the North by a fairly long shot. The North Koreans don't produce any data on the war that you can use. They have never produced a history of the war that is reliable. So we don't know how many North Koreans died, but it may be on the order of a quarter of the population, which would make it something like Poland during World War II. So I want to talk about that because I think not enough people are aware of this, and it goes to the heart of why we still have such a terrible relationship with North Korea. Secondly, and just at the end, another thing that has occurred to me, or I get questions from people, especially young people. They look at Kim Jong Il and they think North Korea must be the worst place in the world. I mean, here's this guy eating lobster on his armored train going to Moscow or something, and the country's starving. And they then assume that North Korea was like that in 1950, when, in fact, what you see today is a kind of fossilized communist regime. I wouldn't say it's on its last legs because it's been on its last legs for 20 years. It has a huge army and is unlikely to collapse, but it is not a regime that could be recommended to anyone, including, of course, the North Korean people. But before the Korean War, North Korea had a coalition of the left, including a lot of nationalists as well as communists, and it, I think, had much more support at that time, both in the North and the South, than any North Korean regime maybe after the 1980s. It's just very hard for people to understand that history moves in utterly unpredictable directions, and what you see today in regard to North Korea is not really what you saw in 1950. In this little book that I did, I drew upon new literature about the bombing of Germany during World War II that has been done by German scholars just recently in the last few years, because it was a subject they really couldn't touch because they thought others, especially non-Germans, would think they're making some sort of an equation with the severe bombing that they suffered and the Holocaust, which is not an equation that they're making. But it was, they presented the most detailed understanding, including the technology of firebombing and city busting that I had ever read. And it made me understand how the same system was then just kind of routinely transferred to North Korea by the U.S. Air Force. Jörg Friedrich wrote, not the book you just saw, but The Fire, the Bombing of Germany, 1940 to 45. You can see what he said there, we sowed the wind over North Korea with just astonishingly heavy bombing campaigns that wiped out almost all of their cities. And we've been reaping the whirlwind ever since, even though we don't know it. I mean, the North Koreans shout themselves hoarse about this. The first thing that was brought up to me on my first visit to North Korea in 1981 was the bombing and how this guide of mine had lost a family member. And he described saber jets just seeming to have fun firing at farmers in the fields. And I had read about this in formerly secret documents and so on, so it wasn't a surprise, but that was 30 years after the war, and they still felt it, and you still saw posters around Pyongyang about this bombing. Meanwhile, in this country, the war is called the Forgotten War. There's a general absence of knowledge about the Korean War. There's an amnesia among those who knew once about it, but have since repressed unfortunate memories, perhaps. And I think a kind of willed unconcern, especially on the part of our government, which knows much more about all of this than it ever tells us. I was just reading a very long 300-page declassified list of targets in North Korea that was compiled after the North Koreans seized the Pueblo, our spy ship, in 1968. This thing is this thick, and it's just got one target after another with all the coordinates, so that in a new war, the North Koreans have to assume that we would be able to bomb everything that is showing above ground. That's why they've moved underground for the last 50 years. They have 15,000, roughly around 15,000 underground facilities of a national security nature in North Korea. This question was posed, of course, after 9/11. We don't hear it very much anymore, but you and I, as American citizens, most of you, might not be too proud to know that we were #1 among the most hated countries in the world in 2011. I also think we're one of the most respected countries in the world, and one that lots of people look to for their own values. I don't know how we came out #1. Probably has something to do with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. North Korea was #4. And Israel and Iran are in between. So you can see that my subject can't help but be controversial. So the basic point I want to make is that a kind of apocalypse happened in North Korea from 1950 to 53, and then there's the absence of knowledge. Here, a kind of riveted memory in North Korea, burned-in memories that they will never forget what happened. And even though it happened 60 years ago, when you're in college or graduate school and you're in your 20s, you can't imagine that you will ever be 60 years old, but I can guarantee you will be. And 60 years sounds like such an unbelievably long time. But I'll show you a photo of the National Defense Commission in North Korea that was at least the one circa 2011, 2010. And many of them are veterans of the Korean War. North Korea has a very old leadership. Their average age is over 80 among top leaders. So you have a kind of gerontocracy. Koreans have always had a close relationship to their own history. They've always had long memories, but these guys in North Korea have longer memories than most people, I think, and I don't think 60 years to them is so long ago. This is a Herblock cartoon from The New Yorker in 1938. It shows what Americans and many people around the world thought of the bombing of civilians in Spain by the Franco forces using German planes, and the bombing of Chinese by the Japanese also in 1938. The State Department condemned this. Before World War II, it was just assumed that you could not target civilians from the air in this way. the way they were doing in Spain and China. But after the German bombing of England in the first couple of years of World War II, all the restraints were off on all sides, at least among the great powers, in terms of how you use this air power. In this little book that I did, I tried to find some fiction, recent fiction that showed any knowledge of the Korean War, that dealt with the Korean War. Philip Roth wrote a Korean War novel called Indignation, where basically he gets kicked out of college for being part of a panty raid. Those were what people did back in the 50s. And ends up in Korea and dies there. And he's, in part of the novel, writing posthumously after he's gone. And he recalls what his father told him about the way banal or incidental or even comical choices that you make in life, let's go on a panty raid, next thing he knows he's in the Korean War, achieve the most disproportionate result. And I use that because I think what is so characteristic of the American air war in Korea is a fundamental lack of proportion. North Korea was not Germany or Japan. North Korea had no air force after the first few weeks of the war. Later on in the war, 1952 and 53, there were Chinese and Soviet MiGs that were being flown against American jets, and it made bombing the North more difficult, but fundamentally the U.S. had control of the air through most of the war. So you have a disparity between what the enemy could do to us and what we could do to the enemy, number one. And number two, you have what is more interesting, really, an utter lack of proportion between what we were doing, this violence, and any relationship to ending the war or winning the war. It didn't make a difference. It didn't make a difference in Germany, didn't make a difference in Japan, Korea, or Vietnam, and yet the Air Force always claims that they win wars with these air campaigns. The air war against North Korea included firebombing, large amounts of napalm, 500-pound bombs, 1,000-pound bombs, many more threats to use atomic weapons than most people know or that historians knew about until their documents were declassified. Even a request to use chemical weapons when the Chinese came into the war. So the idea that this was a limited war, which is what it was called when I was a college student. David Rees wrote a book called The Limited War. It is a kind of absurdity. Toward the end of the war, we even opened up North Korea's large dams, bombed them, something that was considered a war crime when Hitler hit Holland's dams in World War II. But the North Korean dams that the Japanese built were very big ones. I mean, they were modeled on the Hoover Dam. They weren't that big, although the Supung Dam on the Yalu River is second only to the Hoover Dam. But there were many other dams around North Korea. It's a very mountainous place. And just opened up the dams. And in one case, the flood went 27 miles downstream right at the end of the war. Anyway, as I said, this was an elaboration of campaigns that Britain and the U.S. mounted against Nazi Germany. It became clear that you could drop a 1,000-pound bomb and wipe out the defense headquarters or something, but you wouldn't wipe out much else. And half the time, or two-thirds of the time, you wouldn't even be able to hit the defense headquarters because these bombs were very rudimentary. They weren't well aimed. And so it became much easier to burn down large sections of a city than to blow them up. And that's something that was learned by 1943. I never like to read slides, especially not detailed ones like this. But basically, by 1943, you had these magnesium alloy thermite sticks manufactured by the million, bundled together, mixed with benzol, rubber, gel, phosphorus, and that's how you got blockbuster flaming bombs that could wipe out cities in a matter of minutes. You drop a bunch of them, and suddenly Würzburg disappears off the map in 17 minutes. The worst case was the firebombing of Tokyo on March 10th, where 88,000 died in one night, really more than the initial totals at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, although later on with radiation and other injuries, those totals went higher. And this was accepted. It was applauded in Congress and in the Parliament in England. And so Georg Friedrich says modernity gave itself up to a new, incalculable and uncontrollable fate. Firestorms also occurred when atmospheric conditions took the existing firebombs and turned them into a kind of hurricane, which is how Dresden was destroyed, memorialized, of course, in Kurt Vonnegut's famous novel. 12,000 dead, Hamburg, 40,000 dead. The goal was to bring Hitler to his knees with this kind of violence, but of course, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey after the war found that Germans, their will to resist was strengthened by the bombing, and even their industrial production went up. Albert Speer was in charge of it, and he managed to continuously raise their industrial production in spite of all this bombing. So morale wasn't broken. In one of the most amazing things I read, one of the documents said that the level of civilian deaths was still less than predicted, far removed from the generally anticipated total of several millions. They were disappointed, not even several million people being killed, just a few tens of thousands. So it shows you, it makes the point that people had just given up worrying about ancillary civilian casualties, or what the Pentagon calls collateral damage. I've already said most of this. Basically, the Air Force, the minute the war started, Curtis LeMay, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, went to Truman and said, we can stop this war overnight, and proceeded, he and others maintained an all-out assault, really, for the next 3 years, even though they ran out of targets within about 3 months. This is from Curtis LeMay's oral history at Princeton, where he says, look, let's burn down 5 of the biggest towns in North Korea, and that ought to stop it. Then people were saying, oh, it's too horrible, all the non-combatants that die. And then, and I'm quoting him, over a period of 3 years, we burned down every town in North Korea and South Korea too. Over a period of 3 years, this is palatable, but to kill a few people at the start, well, people can't stomach that. General William F. Dean was captured by the North Koreans during the Battle of Daejeon in July 1950 and spent 3 years in a POW camp, actually 3 years mostly with his own guides living with him in North Korea, and wrote a book when he came back. And he talked about going through Hwaechon and was amazed that 2-story buildings on a prominent main street weren't there. Villages were unoccupied shells or snowy open spaces, low mounds of violet ashes. Tibor Mere was a Hungarian correspondent for Hungarian newspaper. He later participated in the rebellion against Hungarian communism, and after that was defeated, he moved to Paris, and we interviewed him for the documentary that David mentioned. And you can see what he said. One of the most interesting things he said, though, was that coming down from the Yalu River to Pyongyang, all he saw was chimneys standing, and he didn't know why chimneys would not fall down, but the buildings that housed the chimneys would disappear. This is Wonsan, port city, roughly opposite Pyongyang on the east coast, which was bombed more than any other city. Chris Springer did a very interesting book that I probably just sold 100 copies a year or two ago, called North Korea Caught in Time, Images of War and Reconstruction. And I'm not too good with PowerPoint. I should have done better, but I didn't want to cut the picture out of the book. This is rubble covering a street in Pyongyang at the end of the war. This is the way Koreans lived, underground with schools, factories, hospitals, and military emplacements, everything underground. And people lived in these low mounds that weren't really very easy to see from the air. Here's a woman looking for her husband at a massacre site in North Korea. I don't know who did the massacre, but the whole terrain around her is blasted. This is from a comic book where the comic book depicts an American soldier caught in friendly fire. And you can read the captions. He asks whatever happened to civilization. And then here on the lower right, he's clearly back in a hospital suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, although they didn't know what to call that in the Korean War. This was the largest conventional bomb available at that time, called the Tarzan. I had to, I think, 6 times correct the proofreader on my 1990 book, who kept making it Tarzan instead of Tarzan. We, in particular, dropped several of these on the town of Kangye up near the Chinese border when we found out that Kim Il-sung and his friends were hiding out there after the U.S. Invaded North Korea. So from December 1950, the North Korean leadership has known the same thing that Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein and others have known, is that, you know, we will try to decapitate you with our weapons. And this one was a very large blunderbuss weapon. This is one of the dams that was breached, and one of several in May and June 1953. Another element of disproportion is to look at what was dropped on Germany: 650,000 tons of bombs, and 635,000 tons on Korea, mostly North Korea. And that doesn't count 32,000 tons of napalm. Only 503,000 tons dropped in the entire Pacific theater in World War II. The Air Force tries to estimate how many Japanese or German or North Korean cities were destroyed in percentage terms. 60 Japanese cities were destroyed to an average of 43%. In North Korea, it ranged from 40 to 90%. And at least 50% of 18 of the 22 major cities were obliterated. So here are the figures from U.S. Air Force records. I've already made this point. Here's another Air Force general saying that the panic and civil disorder created by round-the-clock bombing was the most compelling factor in reaching the armistice. And this is a complicated story, but basically most historians accept that the U.S. and the Russians didn't mind prolonging this war, especially Stalin, who felt the U.S. had bogged hundreds of thousands of troops down in the wrong place at the wrong time. And Stalin's death in March of 1953 is usually seen by most historians as the break point where the Chinese and the Russians and the North Koreans finally agreed to end the war. I have also made this point about North Koreans just learning to live underground in caves and mountains and tunnels on various redoubts. During the aftermath of the 1997-8 famine in North Korea, I've seen the North Koreans referring to, well, they call it the arduous march, which is a reference to events that Kim Il-sung was involved in the 1930s. But they will say that the worst years ever in the history of the DPRK were the famine years in the late 90s and 1951. Friedrich Nietzsche said that memory can be a regulating and punishing judge. A burned-in conviction the best mnemonic to remember something is when violence is used to make you remember it. And I think North Korea, in many ways for the last 60 years, has been a state subordinated to the goal of persisting until they finally win. They won't win, but they're trying to persist until they finally win the Korean War. The Party of Memory in Pyongyang remains concentrated on its main task, the most amazing garrison state in the world, with over 1 million people under arms and all these underground facilities and so on. And we pay no attention until a crisis comes. I see this in my daily life because I haven't gotten a call about North Korea in about a year from the media. It was last November and December when there was some trouble on these islands between North and South Korea on the West Sea that I got a couple of calls. And of course, when they blew off an atomic bomb and launched a long-range missile early in Obama's tenure, which was a really stupid idea on the part of the North Koreans, but they did it. But months will go by and none of the media are interested at all in North Korea. Then there will be a crisis and they'll start calling, and you'll see the troops marching through Pyongyang and so on CNN, and then they'll go on to the next crisis after that one ends. So we don't pay any attention. They're constantly paying attention, and that's one of the deepest problems between us and North Korea. This is also from Chris Springer's book. It shows women constructing, just gathering bricks to construct what is now Kim Il-sung Square in Pyongyang. And here it is in 1957. This building on the left is still the centerpiece building. Whenever they have big parades, you see the army and everybody else marching by there. I've always found this building interesting because when I went there, there was a forlorn, first in 1981, there was a forlorn picture of Karl Marx on this building. And I didn't see a picture of Karl Marx anywhere else in North Korea. But if you went to the Soviet Union before it collapsed, especially on a holiday or something, there would be these huge red banners of Marx and Lenin, their faces, all over the country. And so I saw this forlorn portrait of Marx, and then I saw that when they have their big parades, they put a big red banner down in front of the portrait of Marx, 2 big red banners on this very same building just to hide him. This picture is from 1957. It's from Chris Marker's remarkable book that came out in French, although it's now available. It's newly published with very nicely refurbished photos with both the original French and then an English translation. Chris Marker gave me permission to use these photos in my book and to use them in places like this. They're just remarkable. But this is 1957, and here's a woman with pigtails and a man dealing with rubble. This is also 1957 in Pyongyang. At that time, they were wearing these big round hats. I saw several photos with these big round hats, I suppose, to keep out the sun. You see those in the countryside, but not so much in the cities. And they would have their entertainment. People obviously didn't have very good clothes to wear at that time. Dancing. Dancing in the park with accordions. This is all from Chris Marker's book. Their fashion icons in 1957 were just about like ours. A blonde. And here is the Sputnik that had just gone into outer space. I love this picture with the baby looking back and the mother looking at Sputnik and the poster proclaiming the victory of communism. Sputnik is what got me my fellowship at Columbia, National Defense Foreign Language Fellowship, to learn Korean. It was a major turning point in our studies of the rest of the world. We still, I don't know, they don't call them National Defense Foreign Language Fellowships, but we still get Title VI fellowships from the government. These are, I guess, two widows and a daughter from the Chris Marker book in 1957. This is the National Defense Commission that I mentioned in a 2010 or 2009 picture. Guy in the upper left, Cho Myung-nok, has since died, but he is the only North Korean general ever to go to the White House. He went there in October 2000 to meet with Bill Clinton to keep the nuclear freeze on Yongbyon plutonium facility and to have the U.S. indirectly buy out North Korea's medium and long-range missiles, in other words, their delivery capability for atomic weapons. And his visit was maybe the 12th of October, and then Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State, went to Pyongyang 2 weeks later, and they had a deal that if Bill Clinton would come to Pyongyang and have a summit with Kim Jong Il, then they would sign this agreement and get North Korea into the missile-controlled technology regime. None of that happened, unfortunately, because of the 2000 election taking 5 or 6 weeks to be decided. And once the Supreme Court decided that George Bush would be president, Condoleezza Rice and other advisors said they didn't like this agreement, and they let it fall between the stools. Unfortunately, I think that was the point at which North Korea just decided they would go ahead and manufacture usable nuclear weapons. So we have the party of forgetting and never knowing, paying sporadic attention. And as I've already said, you have a crisis, soldiers goose step through Pyongyang on CNN. And then the waters close over until the next time. But the lack of investigative reporting of people who would go to North Korea and try and find something out or read up a lot on North Korea and try to become informed is just minuscule. One CNN correspondent, whose name I'm right now blanking on, did go a number of times to Pyongyang and write a very good book. And I can't remember the title of the book either. It'll come to me maybe during question and answer. But some of you may know his name. At any rate, he's one of the only examples of somebody who did a lot of investigative work rather than just reacting to the latest crisis. A new Korean war could break out tomorrow. There were really grave worries last November and December about the possibility of things escalating after the shelling of those islands in the West Sea. Americans would still be clueless as to the nature of this conflict, how it originated, how it has developed over 60 years. And armies would clash, and the result would be the central truth: there's no military solution in Korea, and there never was. I don't think North Korea can attack anybody in their neighborhood and win. But I think it would be extremely difficult to defeat North Korea because they're so dug in with more than 1 million troops, and it's such a mountainous country. Our war plan calls for 500,000 American soldiers and a larger number of South Korean soldiers to be in Korea before the war is over or the war is won. But the war plan doesn't talk about who's going to take over and govern North Korea, because I think you might have a defeat of the army or the military, but probably lots of guerrillas that would continue fighting for a long time. So the problem of Korea's division has to be solved politically through diplomacy. It can't be solved militarily. That's what basically my life has taught me since I was a little kid reading those comic books during the Korean War. And it's where Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun were going and where Bill Clinton was going in the late 90s. And it's just unfortunate that even though they had a lot of success, they didn't get further. Now, this is the last part of my talk. There, of course, is Kim Jong Il standing in his not very well tailored jacket that he likes to wear when he's outdoors, and his sunglasses that he seems to wear all the time. Here is what the internet folks make of a picture like this. Dr. Evil, You can get this all over the internet. It's a lot of pretty funny stuff. After they blew off their first atomic bomb in October '06, the leading Halloween costume at the end of the month was the Kim Jong Il. This is his number one son, Kim Jong Nam, a very unflattering photograph. This is his heir apparent. It's Kim Jong Un, even though it says Kim Jong Un in Hangul there. Jong Un is also my wife's name. Korean names are sometimes androgynous and very ambiguous. The characters, of course, are entirely different. And then here he is just a few weeks ago. I wish the focus was a little better. But he is, some people think he's had plastic surgery, but he is being made to look just about what Kim Il-sung looked like circa 1948 or 49. That's what he looked like. So there's the three of them. And you know, reporters call me up, they say, isn't North Korea going through a power struggle? Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said they're going through a power struggle. And I tell them, no, whatever awful things are going on in North Korea, they're not having a power struggle. You know why? Because they've solved the succession problem. It's all going to occur in Kim Il-sung's family. And probably his son will take over 30 or 40 years from now, if they're still around. As I said, I went to North Korea the first time in 1981, and I came in from China, and I wanted to go out through Russia and take the Trans-Siberian Railway, and the Russians wouldn't give me a visa, so I went to the Russian embassy in Pyongyang. They said, pick up your visa at the embassy in Pyongyang. So I went there, and this guy who was very friendly and was one of their Koreanists sat me down, gave me cognac. We talked for 2 hours, and he wouldn't give me a visa because he wanted me to come back the next day and the day after that. So he was trying to figure out what I was doing there. The North Koreans had invited about 16 or 17 American scholars or Korean Americans on Korea to visit in the summer of 1981. But he told me something that I've never forgotten. I said, well, you know, our host showed us the film of the 80th Party Congress, 6th Party Congress in 1980, 6th Party Congress in 1980. And that's where Kim Jong Il is clearly in control. It was his coming out party in 1980. And I said, you know, he doesn't look like his father. His father is a tall man. I'm told that Korean women thought that Kim Il-sung was handsome. Kim Jong Il doesn't look like that. He kind of looks like his mother, you know, if truth be told. He's 5'2", wears elevator shoes, you know, and all of this. And he says, well, you Americans, you know, always thinking that this is a question of personality. They've got a huge knot of bureaucrats behind him in the party and the government and the military. And you should come back here in the year 2020 and watch his son come to power. That's the nature of this system. Well, that's probably the best advice anybody ever gave me about the nature of the succession process in North Korea. They have reinvented monarchy in a communist country, and everybody who is in the elite has a positive interest in supporting this. It doesn't mean that these three guys are all powerful. They're being lied to, they're being bamboozled. It's very difficult for them to get good information out of their underlings, but their underlings all want them to stay there because that's where the legitimacy of this regime lies. There's a very fine book about medieval Europe, and I'm not suggesting that North Korea is medieval, but it's called The King's Two Bodies. And you have one king who is perfect, and he is king forever, and he's king through time. And then you have the human vessels who fill the role of king while they're alive. And some of them are not, you know, all that great. They're not perfect. One of the Habsburg kings had such a bad overbite that he had to have his aides chew his food for him, and then they'd put it in his mouth so he could swallow it. A little bit of inbreeding there in the Habsburg monarchy. But that's the frail human being who is king, but the perfect king continues through time. And any of you that know North Korean ideology and rhetoric know that these three guys are always described as if they walk on water. They're perfect. They've never done anything wrong. Kim Jong Il went around the golf course scoring eagles time and time again on his first golf round. I've played golf since I was a kid, caddying for other people, and I think I've gotten about 3 eagles in my whole life. And I only play 10 times a year maybe, but anyway, it's just absurd. And part of the terrible reputation North Korea has is because it's of the absurdity of these claims, but they fit right in with the king's 2 bodies. And what happened when Kim Il-sung died? Well, they did what the Russians did with Lenin and the Vietnamese did with Ho Chi Minh. They pickled his body so that you can, still see roughly what he looked like, and made a huge mausoleum that they make every foreign guest go through. But they also made him president forever. There no longer is a title, president of North Korea. That's not the title Kim Jong-il holds. Kim Il-sung is president forever. And so it's these very old patterns that are so ingrained in Korean history, where finding a son who can succeed the father is one of the king and queen's primary objectives. And all the people paying attention to which one, or is this guy as good as his father, so on and so forth. This is the way North Korea has superimposed a monarchy on top of their communist system. But Kim Jong-il is not understood as a serious figure around the world. He's a figure of endless ridicule. And it's another thing that makes penetrating North Korea, trying to understand the place, try to figure out how we can deal with them in ways that don't lead to conflict or possible war, makes it very hard. The last couple of slides deal with what, from an historian standpoint, was one of the great outcomes of the 2 terms of Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun from 1998 to 2008, and that is the Korean Truth and Reconciliation Commission, modeled on the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where scholars and activists and people employed by the KTRC did an awful lot of work to literally excavate some of the worst problems of the Korean War and the period before it. In particular, massacres of thousands of people that occurred in the South, and that through very painstaking research and interviewing survivors, exhuming graves, and so on, we now have just a much better understanding of the extraordinarily dirty nature of the conflict in South Korea before and in the first couple of years of the Korean War. And it sometimes makes pretty difficult reading, but to me, they have done the right thing, which is you cannot reconcile enemies until people get to tell their stories. I mean, there are villages where one clan massacred the other clan. Many villages like that in the South, or members of the other clan. And they have to find a way to heal and come together, but people who have burned-in memories of what happened to their father or mother or grandfather are not going to reconcile until their story is told as truthfully as it can be. And so that process is one of healing, restoration, reconciliation as a prelude to a peaceful ending. So I guess it's a tribute to the democracy and the strong civil society that emerged in Korea in the 1990s, and a terrific boon for historians because there's just so much material now available that wasn't before, and really almost too much if you're trying to follow it all. This is sort of making this point already. I don't know how many of you might have read Henrik Kwan's book called Ghosts of War. He's Korean, but he wrote that book about the Vietnam War. He's an anthropologist and visited villages, and talked about how ghosts of people who died during the Vietnam War are still real figures in the lives of families and villagers. It's a very short, profound work, and he's now working on the Korean War. I mean, this is really terrible stuff because the KTRC has determined that in the many massacres they've discovered so far, more than 100,000, possibly as many as 200,000 during the Korean War and 100,000 before the war, that at a 6-to-1 ratio, they were done by Southern authorities rather than North Korean authorities. Now, we don't know what happened in North Korea because they don't do any serious history there. It may be that you'd get a 6-to-1 ratio working the other way in North Korea, but every Korean who lived through the war has terrible memories of these things. What I tried to emphasize in this short book is that Americans have a great responsibility for the coming of the Korean War and for the way it was fought. The air war, above all, I think, is a very serious American responsibility that Americans should reflect on and perhaps eventually do something about. But many of the civilian slaughters that were done by the South Korean authorities were photographed by Americans just standing there watching them. I've seen the photographs. They were declassified in 1999 of a massacre of more than 4,000 political prisoners near Daejeon. Not only that, but the Defense Department made a film of the Daejeon massacre, which was done by South Korean authorities. And in the film, you see just fields of dead people lying in trenches. And they got Humphrey Bogart to narrate it, and they blamed every last death on the communists. So it was just a reversal of black and white for propaganda purposes. And I think a scandal even down to this day. If we had done something like that in Iraq or Afghanistan, it would be news for weeks. But the Korean War went on just at the time when McCarthyism was, the Korean War gave McCarthyism a great head of steam. And so people did not investigate what was going on, or if you did, you could easily run into trouble. And that's another reason for it being a forgotten war. It was a repressed war. Nonetheless, the Korean War was absolutely critical to the American position in the world. Many things were in flux before the Korean War from 1945 to 1950, but after NSC 68 was passed by Congress, which meant the quadrupling of defense expenditure, we then got the enormous foreign military base structure that has just grown ever since until we have more than 900 foreign military bases today. None of that was certain before the Korean War. Probably would have happened if there had been a crisis over Taiwan or some other place. It isn't that the Korean War directly caused this, but it was the incident that really built the American military position in the world. And our troops have still not come home from Korea or from Japan or Germany. And we have bases on the territory of our major allies. This is just unprecedented in world history that England and Italy and Spain and Germany and Japan and Korea all have American military bases, so that you don't really have the action of realpolitik between, say, us and Japan or us and Germany 65 years after World War II, because we have bases on their territory rather than vice versa. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Let me try and get that slide back. This will be a review. I actually don't like doing presentations like this because they're depressing and they're controversial and people get angry, and I just think it's necessary to call attention to these things, because ultimately what we ought to do is know history as much as we can, as well as we can, as objectively as we can, regardless of where the chips are falling. and use that as the basis for reconciliation. Kim Dae-jung gave a speech where he developed a project called A History That Opens the Future, dedicated to honest and new examination of any number of difficult issues in modern Korean history. And his successor continued that and deepened it so that at least as long as Roh Moo-hyun was president, all orthodox and heterodox points of view were getting their hearing. A very wide spectrum exists in South Korea, and people who had been holding in memories for 50 years or 60 years were able to come forward. And what I would like is for the United States to have some sort of similar requiem for the forgotten war that would finally reconcile us with North Korea and with a new generation of South Koreans. Otherwise, the kind of estrangement between Washington and Seoul that was growing and getting worse during the Roh Moo-hyun period, it's not getting worse right now, but it probably will in the future, is going to continue. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry to go 5 minutes past my